Hello, everyone, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the Jet Fuel Microbial Testing webinar, hosted by Airlines for America, the International Air Transport Association, and Joint Inspection Group. I am Romy Ulloa from IATA, and let me start with thanking you for joining us. We will go through our housekeeping notes. As you can see, when entering this webinar, all attendees are muted, and it will remain like throughout the whole webinar. As you can see, the Q&A box is at the bottom right of your screen. If you have a question, select all panelists, not individuals. Type your question and click send. You will only be able to see your questions. We will have great videos to show you. If the sound is too low, increase the volume as you see necessary. At the bottom of the screen, you will have two icons. One is for extending, and the second one is for full screen. The session will be recorded and will be available soon after this webinar for you to be able to share it with your colleagues. Additionally, we'd love to hear from you and hope you have time to fill out the survey. For those of you joining us, welcome and enjoy this webinar. Let me introduce you to Julie van der Busch, a colleague of mine from IATA. She is the Senior Legal Counsel Specialist in Antitrust. Welcome, Julie.
Thank you, Romy. So my role today is to remind all webinar participants that antitrust laws require that each competitor independently makes its own commercial decision about certain matters, such as prices, purchased products, or providers. Today's presentation shall be aimed at helping notably airlines making informed decisions regarding test kits. The information provided shall, however, not include any detail on any commercial aspects. These should be subject to individual discussions and negotiation and addressed offline on a one-to-one basis. This principle also applies to the Q&A sessions. Answers shall not include any commercial aspects. Thank you for your attention and have a nice virtual event.
Thank you, Julie. I would like to introduce you to the presenters of today's webinar on jet fuel microbial testing. It is myself, Mark Vaughan, representing the International Air Transport Association. We have Lee Taylor from the Joint Inspection Group and Amy Carrico from Airlines for America. As a result of the current pandemic, there are about 15,859 aircraft parked with fuel on board. As a result of this, most of the airport fuel farms and storage facilities have static stock in their tanks because of airlines not flying. This calls for measures to be taken to manage the risk of microbial contamination in both aircraft and in these fuel facilities, fuel farms, and storages. Today, we would like to deal with the aspect of microbial testing. What you're not going to hear today, this is not endorsement of any other test kits or the content of presentations. This is not a training on how to manage microbial growth in your systems. And this will not tell you what microbial limits to apply for your specific situation. Importantly, what we are going to hear: fundamentals on microbial growth, and that will be presented by Lee Taylor. Then we will move on to basic principles of proper sampling, presented by Amy. And then we will have how to correctly perform the 4 of the IATA recommended test kits. And this will be presented by the manufacturers of these test kits. And there will be questions and answers after each of these sessions, that you can ask your questions that you want. The 4 test kits that we'll be looking at today is FuelStat, Microbe Monitor 2, EasyCult TTC, as well as EasyCult M, and Highlight Jet A1 fuel test. With that, I would like to just hand over to Amy to introduce. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me just first deal with the slide. Forgive me for that. So importantly, follow your local procedures, your operating standards for the fuel farms and storage facilities. In the case of airlines, follow the procedures in your aircraft maintenance manuals and so forth. It is important to, if you have any further questions, to consult with your equipment manufacturers in the case of aircraft, or whoever provides equipment to the fuel suppliers. Consult with your test kit manufacturers on whatever you need to find out about the testing for microbial growth. And of course, do your own risk assessment. Okay, and with that, I now hand over to Amy.
Thanks, Mark. First up, we're going to have Lee from JIG, who's going to talk about the fundamentals of microbial growth. Lee, over to you.
Thank you, Amy. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone, depending where you are. I'm Lee Taylor. This year marks my 30th year in aviation, 25 of those in fuel. I began my career on the ground as an aircraft refueler, and I'm now a member of the JIG technical team, qualified JIG inspector, and I'm going to talk to you today about the fundamentals of MBG, how it occurs, and how we seek to prevent it. So as fuel moves through a distribution system, it inevitably comes into contact with contaminants. These are predominantly water, dirt or sediment, but also bugs and surfactants. At every stage, we need to employ strategies to reduce and remove these in order to keep the fuel fit for purpose. That's things like training, sampling, filtering, etc. Three elements are necessary in order to initiate and sustain microbial growth in any fuel system. As you can see from this slide, we call it the microbial growth triangle. You have fuel, which is used for the energy, microbes that are ever present in the surrounding environment or as the result of downstream contamination, and water that creates and sustains a viable environment for organisms to grow and thrive. Primary issue with microbial growth is not one of keeping the microbes out of the fuel system, because they're present everywhere in the natural environment around us, and this would be virtually impossible. So the primary issue is one of preventing the conditions that can cause rapid proliferation and lead to fouling and corrosion. So fuel is fundamental in this case. It's our business, and we couldn't, without it, we probably wouldn't have jobs. But microbes are always going to be present. So only the water can be effectively managed to prevent microbial growth. Removal of the water breaks the triangle and prevents the active growth of microbes. So antimicrobial strategies are preferably avoidance strategies, but occasionally they have to be remedial strategies. Obviously, the most environmentally efficient and safest strategy is avoidance by both good facility design and good housekeeping, keeping systems clean, as far as possible free of water, and even facilities with suboptimal design can be managed with appropriate and possibly enhanced water management procedures. As you can see from this slide, microbial growth has impacts both on the aircraft and on the ground. If microbes and the fouling materials they produce are disturbed from the bottom of the tank or interface into the fuel, they can cause rapid filter plugging, fouling of engine fuel system orifices and injectors, can result in flow variations and engine wear and damage. Once these organisms have established a presence in an aircraft fuel system, a variety of operational and maintenance issues can occur that could affect the safe and economic operation of the aircraft. And on the ground, in storage tanks, severe pitting corrosion of the internal steel surface of the tank floor can occur as a result of the activity of certain bacteria. They can also cause poor filter performance, filter disarming, and they can create requirements for enhanced cleaning and maintenance. And ultimately, we're trying to prevent these issues from causing a loss of operational integrity. So this slide, we have a few pictures, a few examples of microbial corrosion. So if I start from the top left picture, but actually the top left and the top right pictures, you can see lots of small areas, lots of flat plates and crevices where water can become trapped and not easily drain away, and this can promote microbial growth. And you can see some indications of microbial growth, which is the brown material against the green paint of the tank in those examples. The middle picture, picture 2 in the top row, that's an example of microbial contamination in a jet fuel storage tank. So you can see that the microbial biomass has settled down and grown on the floor and the top surfaces of pipes, and you can actually see where footprints and squeegee cleaning have revealed the white tank coating. So that brown film is all microbial growth. When a contamination reaches this stage, there really is no alternative to cleaning by hand and physically scrubbing the sludge away. Now, moving to the picture on the bottom left of the slide, this is a picture of a fuel sample. So you can see the water portion at the bottom of the picture and the fuel portion above, with a significant level of microbial activity at the fuel-water interface. And the fuel also shows a stable water haze due to microbial surfactants, and this type of sampling would definitely promote an investigation. Picture 5 in the middle is a good example of a fuel tank, and what this shows you is the consequence of poor design. So the drain point that you can see on the bottom left is not located at the low point of the tank, and therefore you will not be able to effectively drain all of the water, leading to the risk of microbial growth. And note how the contamination can stick to the sides and bottom of the tank, and this can corrode linings or the tank internal surface. Picture 6 is a picture of an open filter vessel for inspection, and you can see what we call leopard spotting on the coalescer elements, and this is mold growth on the coalescer elements. So leopard spotting is often one of the first visible signs that microbial growth is occurring in a fuel facility or in the fuel distribution system upstream, and this should definitely prompt an investigation. So just to close then, knowing what the fundamentals are, what can we try to do to try and keep our systems free from microbial growth? Well, firstly, have operating standards. A robust standard will give you a sound footing to understand important considerations like design, storage procedures, quality control, maintenance and testing, and sampling. Secondly is visually check for water. So visual examination of samples, particularly fuel samples, it's a fundamental part of the routine daily assessment of fuel quality. Not only does it provide an early indication of general contamination such as dirt and water, but also the presence of severe microbial contamination. All samples should be examined for discoloration, haze, emulsified or free water, sludge and microbial material, and Amy will expand further on that in her presentation. So the next step, as we mentioned at the start, is we need to eliminate water from the MBG triangle. So most microbial contaminations such as bacteria and fungi will be predominantly present in the tank bottom, and especially in free water at the fuel-water interface. Growth can normally be detected here first before it spreads into the fuel. So, as mentioned before, removing the water by good housekeeping activities such as routine sampling and flushing is the best way to prevent microbial growth. The next step is to engineer our systems with bugs in mind. You can design facilities in a way which helps stop the proliferation of microbial growth. The aviation industry has greatly improved the design of aircraft fuel installations to help maximize water removal and minimize water accumulation. So that's things like cone down bottoms in tanks, fixed roofs, fast flush systems, lined tanks, elimination of dead legs, and a good filter design. And these are all important aspects of design. Hydrant systems utilize underground pipelines which may accumulate water, microbes and sludge at low points, and then release them into the fuel when the flow velocity increases at a critical stage in the distribution, which is just prior to loading the aircraft. So it's therefore critical that hydrants are also properly designed for the correct flow requirements and routine effective maintenance of the hydrant low points is performed. Early detection, as you'll see in the following presentations by Amy and others, there are many ways to test for MBG growth and to identify this before it becomes a major problem. And lastly, prevention is better than cure. It's simpler, operationally more efficient and more cost effective to prevent contamination in the first place. So just to be a little topical, as we all know from the coronavirus, it's much harder to remediate once you have the infection. Far better to stop it infecting in the first place. That's the end of my presentation. So with that, I'll thank you for your attention and hand you back to Amy.
Thanks, Lee. Great presentation. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is some basic principles for proper sampling for microbial contamination. So the first basic principle that we want to go over is that the test that you're doing is only as good as the sample. So the results from a single sample are really only the results from that single sample and that single sample only. Results from somewhere else in the tank or somewhere else in the system could be different. So if we take a look at the picture, for example, and we're looking for a Wally or a Waldo, and we look here in this little box and we're sampling there, we might say, you know what, there's nothing present. You know, everything looks clear. But if we take a sample from a different location in our system, we find out, oh, there's the Wally, there's the Waldo. He is in fact present. So this is really just to illustrate for you the fact that if you only look in a certain place, you may only find a certain result. And that unless you take proper sampling and unless your system is designed properly, as Lee was just talking about, that you may not get the answer that is fully representative of your entire tank or system. The next thing that I want to talk about, some more principles for microbial growth in general. So all fuel has water in it. That water can be in dissolved water form or it can be in free water form, but all fuel, no matter where you are in the system, will have some water in it. As the fuel cools, any of that dissolved water will drop out of solution. So even if you have a system clear of all free water, if your system starts to cool down, that dissolved water that is always present in jet fuel will start to fall out and become free water. So there's no way to avoid having water in your fuel system altogether, no matter where you are in the world. Typically, microbes are living in fuel. So this is the predominant place that you'll find the presence of microbes is in your fuel. Microbes live in the water predominantly. So the most common place that you will find microbes is in your water layer of your sample. There is possibility that the microbes could be living at the fuel-water interface or sometimes in biofilms on tank surfaces or at the top of your fuel, but predominantly you're going to find the microbes living in the water phase in the system. And it's because of this that if you have a water phase present, a free water phase, you want to do the testing on that water phase if you have it. That's what's recommended. The other thing is that water is heavier than fuel, and so that water will always settle to the low points, wherever those low points may be, whether or not they're where you can take a sample or where you have drains. And because the water always settles to the low point and because the water is always where you're going to find the predominance of microbes, taking samples from your sump or from your low point is the best place to do it. And of course, the benefit of giving a presentation during a pandemic is that you get lots of cute little video pictures like this that emphasize the need to make sure that we're sanitizing things. And indeed, those principles will similarly apply to sampling for microbial growth. So the first thing is that you're going to want to make sure that your sampling equipment is clean and sterile. So in order to do this, you need to rinse your sampling equipment with an alcohol solution. That alcohol solution needs to be at least 70% alcohol or greater. Alternatively, you can use some alcohol-soaked wipes to wipe down your sampling equipment to ensure that it's fully sterilized before you take your sample. This includes your sampling tools. So not just the equipment that you're using, but any tools that may come in contact with the fuel need to be cleaned and sterilized using the same procedure. This also includes between samples. So you must clean and sterilize your equipment and your tools between samples. The reason for this is that if you took a sample and you had microbial contamination in your first sample, that microbial material is going to be on your sampling equipment and on your sampling tools. And if you then go to take a second sample, and that's maybe from a clean system, that microbial material that was from your first sample will cross-contaminate the second sample, and your second sample will show results, even though perhaps that second system or that second sampling point may not have a microbial problem. So you need to make sure that you're sterilizing your equipment between taking samples. We recognize that some equipment is very difficult to sanitize. I'm thinking, for instance, depending on the aircraft type, some of those pogo stick things to take the wing samples can be several meters long. Same thing in a ground system, depending on where your low point is. You might have several meters of sampling line before you actually get fuel or water out of the cap and into your sample container. So we recognize that some equipment may be difficult to sterilize, but we need to make sure we can do what we can to make sure that equipment is fully clean and sterile. It can be done. You just have to take extra caution to make sure all those surfaces have been fully coated and wiped down with the alcohol solution. And of course, after we're using that alcohol, the alcohol must be allowed to evaporate from the samples and from the sampling equipment before you can take a sample. You don't want to contaminate your sample with any of the alcohol solution that you've used to sterilize your equipment. Okay, the next thing that I want to go over is some indicators of microbial contamination. These are just some of the indicators. You may have some of these, you may have none of these, but it's important that we give you some key tips here on what to look for if you have a true and serious microbial contamination problem. So one of the good indicators is if you have a foul smell. So if your sample is smelling really funky, doesn't really smell like jet fuel, that's usually a good indicator that you might have some sort of microbial problem. Sometimes the water in the sample will be brown. Of course, brown water could come from other sources, but it could also be an indicator of a microbial contamination event. And so if you see that brown colored water, you may want to start looking and testing for microbials. Same with particles in the water phase. So yes, particles can come from other sources in your system, but they could also be indicative of a microbial contamination event. And so if you start to see particles in your water, you should think about doing some additional investigation to figure out if you do have a microbial problem. A lacy foam between the fuel and the water layer, that's a really good indication that you have a microbial issue. So if you see anything like that, you should definitely be looking to do some sort of further investigation. Slimes or sludges in your sample, those are really great indicators that you've got a serious microbial issue. Similarly, with matting or spotting on filters, as Lee mentioned, is another great indicator of microbial contamination. I do want to stress, however, that these are just some of the indicators. It is also possible to have none of these indicators present at all, and for you to still have a microbial problem. You could have absolutely what looks to be clean, clear fuel and still be having a microbial contamination situation in your system. So these are just some of the things to keep an eye out for, but certainly by no means everything that would cover a microbial contamination event. Next, we want to talk about sample handling. So after you've taken your sample, it's important that you handle that sample properly in order to get an accurate result. So first, if you've taken a sample in a clear glass container, you should wrap that container so that it's protected from the sunlight. The light can affect the sample and can change or alter the microbial population in that sample. So if you are taking in clear glass containers, you want to use some sort of material to wrap that up so that the sample is not exposed to the light. Also, we'd like to keep our samples cool, but not frozen. So after you take a sample, you don't want it to be sitting out on the apron, baking in the sun, warming up, because that will definitely also change the microbial populations in your sample. Similarly, you don't want to put them in the freezer. So we don't want to keep them absolutely frozen. Cool is best. So in the office, perhaps in the refrigerator if you can. Just important that we're not leaving it exposed to extreme temperatures on either end. So not very hot and not very cold. Finally, on sample handling, reusing sample containers can lead to cross-contamination. So similar to how we were talking about making sure that we're sterilizing our sampling equipment, The same principles would apply to our sample containers. And it's for this reason and the risk of cross-contamination that we prefer, where we can, to use disposable sample containers. And not really sample handling, but just a good reminder and a good practice. Make sure that you're labeling your samples. We see a lot of times people will forget to bring a pen out or something when they're taking their microbial samples. And it's really important that when you're taking your samples and then you've gotten results, that you've got that sample labeled and know where in your system that sample corresponded to, so that you can go back and take further action if necessary. Okay, in sampling, time is of the essence. So after you've taken that sample, the microbial populations in that sample container can change over time. Even as little as a few hours can change the types and the amounts of microbes that are present in your sample. So it's for this reason that we want to make sure that testing is done as soon as possible after you've taken your sample, using our proper handling procedures, so that the results that you're getting are truly indicative of your system and not of some change that's happened within the sampling container after you've taken your sample. The last principle that I wanted to cover is if you're doing sampling for trend monitoring. Trend monitoring is very common when looking at microbial contamination issues. Folks will take samples of a system over time to notice when they get an uptick in microbial activity, so that they can catch it as early as possible, as Lee was pointing out. So these are some principles if you are doing trend monitoring. So if you are trend monitoring, you're going to want to make sure you sample from the same point every time in that system. You're going to want to make sure you're sampling under the same conditions and that you're using the same test kit every single time. And I want to emphasize that these principles apply only to doing trend monitoring, because, for instance, if you start to find evidence of a microbial contamination event, some of the guidance involves potentially using additional test kits to verify or to see different species of bacteria or yeast, molds, et cetera, that may be present. So this advice here, or this recommendation here, is really specific to trend monitoring only. Okay. And I think that's it for our basics and our principles of good sampling for microbial contamination. Next in the webinar, we're going to move into all the test kit manufacturers who will give you a quick how-to on their test kits. I'd like to let everybody know that the order in which the participants were, or the presenters were chosen, was random, so don't read anything into that. Also remind everyone that you have your Q&A box. Please make sure you're submitting your questions to all panelists and not to an individual panelist. And finally, I would like to mention that we will likely not be able to get to all of your questions. If we don't answer your question during the webinar, we will endeavor to reach out to you afterwards to address that one-on-one. Alternatively, we will be providing contact information for each one of the panelists.
I'm David Mitchell from Carrera Bioscience, makers of FuelStat. I'm here to demonstrate FuelStat today. We don't require any previous experience to use FuelStat. FuelStat itself is an antibody test, so it's only searching for the markers of contamination. It's simple, it's fast, takes about 15 minutes in total, and also you don't require any additional equipment. We've been aware through the COVID crisis of how not to spread contamination, but this doesn't apply to FuelStat. All we require is a clean sampling container, and we always recommend alcohol wipes are used to clean the sampling containers before use. The FuelStat test itself is generally done on site in the hangar or the workshop. The sample does not require to be transported off site, so this helps airlines adhere to ASTM D6469 section 8.5 on the handling and the transport of fuel. The process itself is quite simple. What we do first is we show a video that takes the trainees through the A to Z of how to use the test. Then the trainer, in this case me, will demonstrate how to use the test. Then we will run a video on the free app, FuelStat Result, that comes with FuelStat. And whilst that video is running, the test itself will form. And after that, we will read the test, manually interpret the test, and we will also use the app to verify the result. Further to that, the trainees will then practice using the test. They will practice using the app, and they will be shown the portal so they can access the information that's acquired from the test itself. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to run the video on how to use the test, and after that I will demonstrate using the test itself.
Before starting testing with FuelStat, always put on nitrile blue gloves. Have a clean, clear workspace and some paper towels on hand. You are ready to start. Do not open test up until you have sample ready and are ready to test. Each kit contains one test paddle, a pipette, test bottle, and instructions. These instructions are available in multiple languages. Always take fuel sample from the bottom of the tank. It is important to use a clean sample container. Leave until sample settles. It is always advisable to conduct FuelStat test as soon as sample has settled. It is always better for more accurate results to test the water phase if possible. For a generous water sample, always hold pipette closed when extracting water from a fuel water sample. Fill to bottom line of sampling bottle. Where there is only minimal water evident, do not worry if water will not reach bottom line. Always fill as much as possible and then top up with fuel. If no water is evident, fill up to top line with fuel. Now tighten the dropper cap onto the bottle and shake for 5 seconds. It is best to hold bottle for 90 seconds at angle before turning bottle totally upside down for 1 minute. Make sure all fuel is removed from the funnel so only blue liquid is tested. Do not turn the bottle from pointing down to pointing up after first row of paddles. If you do turn bottle over by mistake, then remember to let the blue fluid settle to bottom again and put first 4 drops onto a tissue before continuing. Place 4 drops into each well. It is important to never let any fluid onto the viewing panes. This may ruin the test. Wait 10 minutes. It is best not to touch the test during this time. This is the control line, C. This is the test line, T. This side is the low contamination indicators, L. This side is the high contamination indicators, H. Successful tests must have a control line in all windows. Results are determined by either lines forming or being absent on the low side or on both low and high. Follow the simple traffic light system. All 12 lines forming is green. This is negative contamination. Any individual missing test T lines on the low side is amber. This is a moderate contamination. Two or more missing test T lines on the low side is red. This is a heavy contamination. Any missing test T lines on the high side is red. This is a heavy contamination. This is in line with IATA and JIG guidelines. It does not matter if some lines are fainter. A line means no low or high contamination. If any red control line C has not formed or is blue, the test is invalid. To summarize, all 12 lines means green, negative. Individual lines missing on low side mean amber, moderate. Any lines missing on high side or 2 or more lines missing on low side means red, heavy. Always remember, help is at hand. Email info@conidia.com.
That's us watched the video, now time to do the test. I've put on a pair of blue nitrile gloves here to conduct the test, which is our recommendation when using FuelStat. I've removed the components from the test itself. Let's just run through them again. We have the test itself. We have the sampling bottle with the blue extraction fluid. We have a dropper cap. We have a pipette, which will remove the water from any water bottom in a sample. And we also have full instructions with every kit. So we're ready to go now. I've decanted the jet fuel sample into a clear sampling container, and this allows me to observe if there is any water bottom in the sample. In this case, there is no water bottom in the sample, so we're going to be testing the fuel. I am going to be filling up the bottle to this line, fill fuel to this line. So let's do that. All I simply do is pour the fuel with a relatively steady hand, I hope, into the bottle. And once we're on the line, that's enough fuel. I then use the dropper cap and tighten that on, and I put the lid of the dropper cap on. I then hold the bottle down and I shake the fluid for about 5 or 10 seconds. I then hold the bottle at 45 degrees, and this will allow the extraction fluid to separate from the fuel completely. This process takes a few minutes, but we can already see the blue fluid forming to the bottom. Now that the blue fluid is completely separated, we'll hold the bottle pointing down the way, and what we're now going to do is remove 4 drops from the nozzle in case there's any residue fuel in the nozzle itself. We are testing the blue extraction fluid here, we're not testing the fuel itself. So I'll simply, as per the video, I'll simply take that drop off, 1, 2, 3 and 4, and then put the nozzle back on. I'm now ready to do the test. It's important that we never point the nozzle up the way. When we've done that process, we are allowing the blue fluid to be what's tested with FuelStat. So I'm now going to do the test. So I take the dropper cap off, 1, 2, 3 and 4, 1, 2, 3 and 4, 1, 2, 3 and 4, 1, 3 and 4, 1, 2, 3, 3 and 4, and 1, 2, 3 and 4. Then put the dropper cap off and we wait another 10 minutes and the test will form. While we're doing that, we're now going to run the app video, and after the app video the test results will be formed. We're going to manually read the test and we're going to use the app to verify the results of the test as well. So let's watch the video now.
FuelStat Result is a smartphone-based app on iOS and Android that helps with both the interpretation of the FuelStat test and the collection of data in an easy-to-use format. The app benefits are compliance and trend analysis of testing without paper and reduces the risk of incorrect interpretation. The following video takes you through all the steps and functions of the app. The FuelStat app is designed to work on the following models: iPhone 6 onwards, iPad Pro, Samsung Galaxy 6 onwards. The app has also been used successfully by most other modern brands and models of smartphones and tablets with an LED flash running on an Android platform. The app is intended to support the manual reading of the test and as a way of recording the information to a central point from anywhere in the globe within seconds. Users should always read the test manually prior to using the app, which will verify the result and record the data to a web-based central location. If for any reason you have a non-functioning smartphone, continue to manually read the test paddle. Full instructions on completing the test and interpreting the test result are included in every test pack. These instructions are available in multiple languages. You, as the testers, will receive an invite to download the app. The tester should use the supplied password, but they have the option to change this by logging onto the app and using the forgotten password link. When downloading the app, the user is required to be connected to Wi-Fi or a mobile data-enabled area to log in. It is also required to have the GPS signal enabled and location services set to on. FuelStat result works offline in the workshop or hangar as long as the user is logged in. Once the user returns to Wi-Fi or mobile data, then any data that is not sent will be uploaded to the portal. Data uploads with mobile data. Wi-Fi is not mandatory, but may be faster and cheaper than mobile data. In the menu, the user can view the last 10 results and whether or not the result has been uploaded. This will be covered when we run through the menu. It is not necessary to scan the test paddle immediately with FuelStat result, but it is good practice to record the result with the app within 24 hours. Please note that the camera's flash will be turned on automatically when the scanning phase is initialized. It is important not to block the flash while scanning is carried out. It is best to scan the test in artificial light only, as any natural light, including daylight through windows, may compete with the flash and give an uncertain result. Please note that the flash will be automatically activated by the app. It is easy to know if there are competing light sources. The scan itself may take longer than the usual 2 to 3 seconds and may have warning triangles indicating difficulty in reading. If this happens, remember that the test does not have to be scanned immediately. If you wish to retry, simply press Read Test to reset. Okay, it's time to use the app and then describe all the functions on the phone and the data access. Once you have downloaded the app, it is time to open it and log in. For security and power preservation, the app has an automatic shutdown after 24 hours, so you will need to log in every day. It is better to log out after use via the menu function. Once you have logged in successfully, you will be presented with the Read Test field. It is only necessary to fill in the top line marked asterisk, but most organizations will insist on details of the asset, the location of tank, etc. for future reference. The FuelStat lot number can be found on the foil packet. This is very useful for quality control purposes. Once you have completed the fields, then simply press Run. If you have made a mistake, then pressing Reset will clear all fields. Now hold the phone over the FuelStat test paddle. You will see red outlines. Move the test closer or pull back until the outlines turn green and the test is scanned. The result will be displayed on the phone. You have the option of putting any notes here on the test. Verify this agrees with manual reading of the test. Now press Done and the test will be uploaded if connected to Wi-Fi or mobile data, or will be uploaded the next time the phone is connected. That's all you need to do to use the app. Just watch for the special conditions like lighting. Now let's explore the other features of the app. Press Menu and this screen appears. Read Test means start a new test. Result History gives a log of the last 10 results and whether those results have been uploaded yet. A tick appears next to results that have already been sent, while a cloud appears next to those that are waiting to be sent when the phone is next online. Note that your manager can only see the results once they have been uploaded to the portal. Instructions are short animated videos for both the test and the app to help you understand how to use them if required. About gives information on the current version. This is important as there may have been updates that affect performance. Check with your FuelStat manager to make sure your app is up to date. You'll also find contact details for Canidia here. Camera validation. This is an app development tool and can be ignored. Use Logout to log out of the app, which is worthwhile for battery preservation if nothing else.
Now we've watched the app video, it's time to manually interpret the test and also use the app to verify the result of the test. So this is the test that we've just done here, and we call these paddles, and each of the paddles we have clearly a control line and we have clearly a test line as well visible. So this is a negligible test. I've downloaded the app already from the App Store or from Google Play, and when I open it I'm faced with this screen. This is called the identity screen. This is where you can put any information of the asset in to be able to retrieve it later. So the purposes of this demonstration, I've called this Airline A, and I could fill in the registration number, the tail number, I can fill in the tank location, right, middle or left, I can fill in the fuel supplier, I can fill in aircraft type, I can fill in anything at all I want into these fields. Once I've done that, all I do is press run and then simply hover my smartphone over the test itself, and this will confirm the result that I've read manually. At this point, I also have the option of telling the manager any additional information that I want to. So I could say, for example, this is a retest of a test I did last week, which would be valuable information for the manager to know in this field here. And once I'm happy with that, I simply press done on that part. That's the test completed. And now press done and the work is complete for that test. Now we're going to look at the portal so we can actually see how to retrieve the information that's been stored by the app and the additional features of the app itself. So let's run the video for the portal.
So that's the phone part. Now to describe where to access the information generated, what the information looks like, and the functions, so you get the most out of the system. Put the address shown on the screen into the address bar, not the search box of your browser. Log in with the same username and password. The manager will be able to view all results from any location globally. This is the information you see first. Toggle this switch to expand all fields. The identity details inputted at the read test stage on the app will be replicated exactly, so the more information, the better. On the right, you will see a clipboard. Press this to view more exact details of the test results. The most important function on this page is the PDF function. This generates a laboratory-style report for storage and/or printing if required, with all details clearly marked. This is very important for record keeping. Finally, go back to the results page on the portal and scroll down to the Export to Excel tab for easy transfer and analysis. You get options for exporting the last 1,000 items or all items. So that is FuelStat result. Once you understand how it works, it is easy to use in seconds and sends information almost instantly without paper and is recorded without error. It helps in engineering being assured that results taken in the workshops or hangars have been interpreted correctly. And it's free.
So that's FuelStat and FuelStat result. Very simple, very fast, very easy to do anywhere. I thank you for watching the demonstration, and now we welcome any questions regarding the test or how to use the test or any other questions regarding FuelStat.
Yeah, and we'll be going over the next few minutes the question and answers asked by the public that was sent over during the video. First of all, thanks for joining this webinar. Great initiative from A4A, JIG, and IATA this time of pandemic, and where fuel quality on board aircraft system is more critical than ever as far as we're concerned. So thanks for joining. Thanks for all the good questions. I've got a whole list here. So I'll try my best to go through the question, myself and Dave. And provide you with some concise and clear answer to your questions. All questions are good answers, are good questions, sorry, and hopefully we'll have good answers for you. And as Amy mentioned, if we don't have time to answer all the questions, they'll be collated and they'll be directed to all the test kit manufacturer, and we'll follow up with you with your questions. First question there that we've received is, what is the recommended temperature to keep sample taken for microbial test? Amy touched on this. It's quite important that once you take the sample, if you're not going to conduct right away the testing, as an example with FuelStat, that you keep that sample cool in order to ship it to your location, the office, or the laboratory that will be conducting the test. So basically, fridge temperature, just the analogy is if you put it in a transportation pack with some ice pack to keep it cool, so probably somewhere around 3 degrees, 4 degrees Celsius is probably the range of temperature at which you want to keep the sample. You don't want to freeze the sample, not at all, because it will alter, obviously, the potential contaminant that is present, the microbes, the microorganism present in the sample. Certainly you don't want to leave it at room temperature, especially at elevated temperature, because it will definitely alter the ecosystem, if you want, of these microorganisms in your sample. So basically 3-4 degrees Celsius on ice pack is ideal condition. Another question that we've received is from the public is, what is FuelStat looking for? Exactly, what's the science behind this? FuelStat is very much an antibody test. We can all relate that in these day and age, but antibody test, very similar to a pregnancy test, is looking for specific markers. In this case, FuelStat is looking for metabolic antigenic material. It's basically, once you've got the microorganism, one of the metabolites is antigenes of these microorganisms that will form in your fuel-water interface or water phase. And basically, what FuelStat is all about is looking for the presence of these antigenes into the samples. And how do we do that? Is on the laminar flow device that you saw in the video, we've got fixed concentration, threshold concentration of antibodies that are specific to strains of bacteria, yeast, and fungus, and one in particular, Ermoconus resinae, that we know is detrimental to fuel and fuel system. So we've got these antibodies to these microorganisms that are fixed on the laminar flow device at certain concentration. And basically, if you exceed these concentration, this is what you see when you visually analyze the test after conducting your sample test, or with what the application, the software application, will be looking for, interpreting these results. And that gave into another question regarding the correlation between what we see here and CFUs or other units. When we developed this test kit about 20 years ago, we did quite a bit of research, not only for looking for these bad species in fuel, but also correlating to reference test methods such as IP385, which is basically a reference test method that delivers colony-forming units results. And basically, we correlated the threshold values that we fix on these laminar flow devices, and which is reported in micrograms per liters of antigenic material. So basically, there's some research study and technical reports that are available that we could work with you or provide you with that basically correlate the antigenic concentration material with some of the work that we've done. Most recently, we also compare some contaminated samples with ATP technology and others. So basically, we try to understand where we fit with respect to the threshold values that we've got on our laminar flow device in relationship to other test methods, basically. Very good question here from one airline regarding where is the portal regarding the software application? Where is the portal stored, and who has control or access to the portal data for the fuel stat test results? So I'll pass it on to David. David should be online to answer this question. David?
Thank you, Pierre. Yes, a very good question, and it came up in the last session as well. So very good to cover. We actually have two versions of the app. For terms of time, we only showed one version. We have a generic, what would be called a light version of the app that is used and inputted without any details. So simply users would do the test, they would verify the result and take a screenshot and send it to the manager, and any details of the asset would simply be attached to the text message or the email that the screenshot itself was sent with. That would mean that the actual test itself is anonymous, and most of our IT people would be relatively happy with that because there's no confidential information. We have the full version of the app Fuel Stat Result, which is what you've seen, which gives you full portal access, and the information is stored in what is effectively private data compartments where only the user has access. This is supported by a full set of terms and conditions that so far has been okayed by several major customers to be one, secure, and two, to be private. The data itself is not sold, it's not used, it's not accessed or transferred to any third party. It is hosted by Canidia and by Canidia's IT providers, but the access that we would have to the data would be simply for maintenance and any system problems that we had with the information. So totally private. The other question that users have as well is about encryption, and the encryption which comes as standard with Fuel Stat Result is what is known as bank level security. So what we could expect large money transfers to be transferred over the ether, then that's the same standard that Fuel Stat is moving to as well. So hopefully that's answered your questions, but again, please come back to us with any more detailed questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Dave. Moving on to other questions as well. As a fuel tank and tank cleaning company, we manufacture and use beacon bombs made from aluminum and stainless steel. Is this acceptable to use to take fuel tank bottom sample in aviation fuel tanks? Yes, it is. If you can actually take an actual bottom sample, then you can use this equipment. Sometimes based on tank designs, there's no drain line, there's no sump lines, and it depends on the actual configuration of the storage tanks. Bottom line is that if there's any condensation or free water in the storage tank, it will settle in the bottom, and you want to make sure that you do test either the water phase or the fuel phase if there's no water in the bottom. Make sure, be mindful though, that having a drain line or a sump line in a storage tank, you must displace a minimum amount of volume that basically is equivalent to the sump line in order to get to the actual bottom sample of the tank itself, so that you're going to be testing the fuel that's in the tank and not the residual fuel that would be in the sump line or the drain line. So that's quite critical.
Okay, thank you, Pierre. This is about all the time we have. I apologize to have to cut off what is some great questions and answers. Thank you to David and to Pierre for the information. And as I mentioned previously, questions that we did not get to, we will endeavor to reach out to you directly. Otherwise, you can also feel free to reach out to the presenters individually to ask your questions. I did also want to note very briefly, I've seen some of you are having trouble hearing the audio for the videos as the videos are playing. We've had several folks have some success if they use their PC for the audio instead of dialing in. So if you're having trouble still with the audio on the videos, you may want to try that, and I apologize for that. But the session is being recorded. So if for whatever reason you're not able to get the audio working, you will be able to watch the video afterwards. And feel free to continue to stay on so you can see the slides and ask your questions. Okay, our next presenters, we have Graham Hill and Mike Haywood from IATA Microbiology.
Thank you very much, Amy. Thanks for IATA, JIG, and A4A for inviting us to participate in this initiative, which I think is a really good initiative. So I'm going to talk to you about the Microbe Monitor 2 test. I just need to. So, as I say, IATA Microbiology has over 35 years experience in the detection and control of microbiological contamination, or MBG, in industrial systems, particularly in fuel systems. And I'm going to talk about how to use the Microbe Monitor 2 to detect microbial contamination in aviation fuel systems. And I'll talk about how to do this both for aircraft fuel tanks and also for storage tanks and infrastructure in the aviation fuel supply chain. This training session is actually based on some online animations which we have on our website, which is www.echamicrobiology.com. So you can always go and refresh there on these sort of training tools. So what's in my aircraft fuel tank? Well, as we've seen, if you have water in a fuel tank, there is a risk of microbiological growth. And the rate and extent of that growth will depend on the amount of water present and on other factors, and particularly temperature. So when we look at parked aircraft, that's a particular concern because of the warmer temperatures. An active microbial growth can occur wherever free water accumulates in the tank, as we've seen. So pockets of water in the tank bottom and at low points, but also on surfaces where water condensation forms. And with agitation and turbulence in the tank, this microbial material is disturbed up into the fuel, and common fuel contaminants like fungi actually produce spores which are repelled from the water and dispersed into the fuel, spreading and colonizing new areas of the tank where water may be present. So it's important to consider this uneven dispersion of microbes in the fuel tank. For a start, if we test different samples from the same tank, we may get variation in test results. And in particular, we'll always expect to see many more microbes in water samples than we do in fuel samples. And as has been said, collecting water gives us the best chance of an early detection of a microbial growth problem. But of course, in reality, it's not always practical to recover water in samples. And so that's why we believe it's very important to have a sensitive test method which is able to detect microbes and spores dispersed in the fuel, because these may be the only indication you have of a potential problem. And of course, regular draining of tanks to remove water is the single most important measure you can take to prevent microbial growth. Otherwise, you can end up with something looking like this. The slimes, biofilms on the tanks, and ultimately corrosion. But unfortunately, of course, all this happens inside the tank and you can't see it. So you can't go into a tank and inspect it on a regular basis. We can take samples and we can look at them. And if we have a sample that looks like this one on the right, well, unfortunately, we already have a severe problem and a potential for operational and safety issues. So we ideally want to be able to detect contamination before we get to that stage, because significant levels aren't always visually apparent. As I say, we want to look at taking samples from the bottom, the drains on fuel tanks, using a consistent procedure. With aircraft, this should be after the aircraft has been standing to allow water to thaw and also for water to settle to low points in the tanks. We don't want to flush drain points on aircraft tanks because we want to sample the very first fluid that's coming out of the tank. And we want to take about 1 liter of sample if we can. We don't need that volume to do Microbe Monitor 2 tests, but it maximizes the chances of recovering water. And ideally, we would sample each drain point on each tank. But always refer to your specific aircraft maintenance manual, or AMM, for the correct sampling procedure for your aircraft, and also in respect of frequency of sampling. What about fuel storage tanks? Same principle applies. Ideally, we want to take bottom samples, and usually these will be from drain points, but as has been mentioned, we can also use bottom sampling devices. However, because fuel supply facilities have very rigorous water draining regimes, it actually is often very difficult to recover any water in the sample. So in a routine monitoring program, it may be better to regularly test fuel phase samples from the bottom of the tank to ensure consistency. So samples will ideally be taken at the time of daily dewatering procedures, but you do need to flush the drain line contents in this case, because what we actually want to sample is what's in the tank, not what's in the drain line, because you may have several meters of drain line outside the tank which don't represent what's in the tank. So here's the Micromonitor 2 test. It comes in packs of 5 tests. We also do bulk packs of 50 tests, and it's published as an IP standard method IP613, and also as an ASTM equivalent D7978. And it's basically a glass bottle containing a special gel that grows microbes, and a syringe which is used to dispense fuel or water sample into the test bottle. Before starting the test, there's a plastic seal on the cap, which you need to just remove and discard. It also helps just to loosen the cap before you start, as this will help you when you're doing the test procedure later. So, before we start, just a word on how quickly we should test. Ideally, as soon as possible after sampling. Ideally within 4 hours. Again, often practically not possible. We recommend no more than 24 hours. After that time, we know that you can start to get some die-off of microorganisms in fuel samples, so you may underestimate contamination. So first thing, shake your sample for 30 seconds to mix up the fuel and water. Then let it stand for 12 minutes so that you get a separation of the fuel and water phases. This will allow suspended free water droplets to settle out. It will enable you to observe the sample to see whether water is present. Now, if water is present, as I say, with the Micromonitor 2, we always recommend you test it because it provides the worst case indication of contamination. And that means the earliest indication of contamination. But fuel phase can also be tested if required, or if there is no water present. And as I've said, where you don't often recover water in your sampling when you're conducting regular testing programs, then we recommend always testing the fuel phase. So, the testing procedure for fuel and water is slightly different for the Micromonitor 2 tests. When testing water, the syringe should be used to remove water from the bottom of the sample container. It may be necessary to decant off some fuel to enable you to access the water, or you can transfer the water to a separate clean container to enable you to take it out with the syringe. For the fuel, remember you've let the water settle out, so we say test fuel directly from the sample container about 3 centimeters below the surface of the fuel in the sample container. And it's important to avoid touching parts of the syringe which have come in contact with the sample or with your hands. As I say, your hands can potentially contaminate the sample. Now, for water, we recommend 0.1 milliliters is tested, and for fuel, we recommend 0.5 milliliters is tested because we need slightly more sensitivity in the fuel because there's less microorganisms generally present in fuel. To get the right volume, you can draw up the sample into the syringe more than you need and then depress the plunger until it aligns with the correct graduation mark. Then you dispense the sample into the Micromonitor 2 by depressing the plunger on the syringe. And you can then, first of course, you need to remove the cap of the bottle, make sure that goes on a clean surface. Then you recap the bottle, just tap the bottle to break up the gel, and then shake it for 30 seconds to disperse your sample through the gel in the test bottle. After that, you should see it has an even liquid consistency. You flick it down to the bottom of the bottle, then tap it on your hand to form an even layer of gel, as you can see here in the picture. Now, the shaking procedure actually can be made a lot easier. We supply these, what we call bumpers, which attach to a desktop, and you can bash the test against those, and it makes the procedure a lot easier. So here we see a Micromonitor 2 test after shaking and allowing the gel to form a flat layer. Eventually the gel will re-solidify, but it's now ready to incubate to allow the microbes in the gel to grow. So Micromonitor 2 should be incubated in a warm, dark place. It can be conveniently incubated in the box that the test is supplied in, for example, by placing this in a warm cupboard or a drawer in a room with a relatively consistent temperature. And the recommended temperature, sorry, I'm going to go centigrade, is 25 degrees centigrade, plus or minus 3, so that's 22 to 28, but also, as I say, 77 Fahrenheit, plus or minus 6 degrees Fahrenheit. But small, occasional fluctuations outside this range do not critically affect the test performance. If you're warmer than this, if your sample is taken from a warmer environment, that doesn't matter. You can actually incubate the test at the equivalent ambient temperature. But we don't recommend incubating above 40 degrees centigrade or 104 degrees Fahrenheit. You can use an incubator if you have a problem finding an area with a consistent temperature. We do little small incubators which help to optimize the performance of the tests, and larger ones if you need to do a lot of tests. So reading the test results, what Micromonitor 2 does is it produces a result of what's called CFU, or colony forming units, which is a standard measure of microbiological contamination used in a very wide range of industries. As the test is incubated, each microbe utilizes the nutrients in the gel and also the nutrients in the fuel sample itself to grow and multiply until it forms a visible spot. And that spot is called a colony. And each colony is derived from a single microbe in the sample, or an aggregate of microbes, or a spore, or a fragment of fungus. And typically, the important microbes in fuel systems take up to 4 days to produce visible colonies. Generally, the more microbes there are, the quicker the colonies will become visible. And the different types of microbes found in fuel can produce colonies with different shapes and sizes, but it's the number of colonies which is important. This can be counted or estimated and converted to numbers of CFU per liter of water, or sorry, of fuel, or CFU per milliliter of water, depending on which type of sample is tested. So here we see incubation of some tests which have been used to test water. And after 1 day, if a heavy contamination is present, as shown on the right, you may be able to see colonies already. You don't need to look at the test every day, but we do recommend examining it for several days, up to 4 days. And after this time, the final test result can be read. If you can already see a heavy contamination after just 1 or 2 days, there's no need to incubate it further. So when testing water, you'll have more microbes than if you test fuel. And often there are too many to actually count. So what you need to do is you compare the appearance of the test to a calibration or chart which comes with the test instructions. And from this, you can read the number of colony forming units, or CFU, per milliliter of water. And there are some standards in terms of what represents negligible, moderate, or heavy. And I've shown here standards for water phase samples from the IATA guidance material on microbial contamination in aircraft fuel tanks. But these standards are specific for aircraft fuel tank strains, and they are for guidance only. It's always possible to choose your own contamination limits based on your experience. And the Micromonitor 2 test is very flexible in that respect. So here's some fuel test results showing the same thing. As you see, there's generally fewer colonies, but again, a heavy contamination often apparent after 1 or 2 days. In fact, for a clean fuel, you usually get either a completely clear test or maybe just 1 colony on the test. But as I say, again, it's incubate up to 4 days, at which point the final test result can be read. So when testing fuel samples, it's normally possible to actually count the number of colonies which is present. And from that, you can calculate the number of CFU per liter. This is the number of colonies counted times 2,000. For some reason, convention has always dictated that when we're testing fuel, we express numbers per litre, and when we're testing water, we express numbers of CFU per milliliter. So just be careful when you're reading test reports that you understand how those results have been expressed. And again, I'm showing some standards for fuel test results. Again, these are taken from the IATA guidance material, and I stress they are for guidance only. And in particular, these limits are appropriate generally for samples from aircraft fuel tank drains. For samples taken from the fuel supply chain, particularly samples upstream of the interplane fueling operation, you'll generally expect less stringent limit values because obviously the fuel has to go through stages of filtration after that. And overall, the contamination may show higher levels of background contamination. There's a very good JIG technical information document on microbial monitoring strategies available from JIG online free of charge, and this has some guidance on appropriate limits for aviation fuel supply. But one thing I want to stress is it's important to appreciate that heavy contamination doesn't necessarily mean the fuel is unfit for use, nor does it mean that there is already severe visible growth occurring inside the fuel tank. It is merely an indication that the contamination is above normal, that microbial growth is likely to be occurring, and of course, unless something is done to prevent it, the situation could well get worse. But you generally have time to act. And the first action will usually be to check your system by taking a fresh sample and testing that to see whether that result is confirmed. Of course, not acting could result in serious issues. I'd also say there's not always a correlation between the level of contamination in fuel and water phase samples. If you test both fuel and water, we generally recommend acting on the level of contamination which indicates the worst category according to which sample was tested. So if the water was heavy but the fuel was moderate, we'd say count that as a heavy contamination. There may be exceptions to that, and we can give specific advice to users based on their experience, but that's the general recommendation. So in summary, Micromonitor 2 provides the counting process and estimating number of colonies is simple. You don't need specialist equipment. It provides a clear visual indication of the severity of contamination. Remember, it's the number of spots, not their size, which is important. And remember, the contamination limits I've shown you are for guidance only. The Micromonitor 2 test is flexible enough to adjust these according to your particular experience and requirements. So I hope this training session has been useful. We have a lot more technical guidance and answers to frequently asked questions on our website, and I'm very happy to take any specific questions now. Thank you. Okay, I've got some questions coming through, and the first one I have here is, how broad spectrum is the growth gel for Micromonitor 2? Does it tend to be better for growing bacteria or fungi? Okay, we've tested against a very wide range of microorganisms isolated in the field. It will grow fungi and bacteria well. Certainly all of the common fungi found in fuel systems, including Penicillium species, Poecilomyces, Hormoconus resinae, Micromonitor 2 grows very well. Bacteria tend to be more varied in their growth requirements. Again, for most of the bacteria which grow well in fuel systems, we find very good recovery. It's possible you may get some specialist bacteria. So, for example, some marine bacteria may have a special requirement for high salt present, and it doesn't grow those so well. But by and large, it grows, has very good concordance with standard techniques using molecular biology. We show good concordance with those methods for detecting the common fuel contaminants. I've got another question here. For Micromonitor 2, what results are, but the question doesn't finish. So are needed to leave, sorry, just read this question correctly. We need to leave decanting of the sample to see the water phase and to know if you have time to take the volume from the bottom. That's correct. You want to get a good mix of the sample, but you You also don't want to, if you're testing fuel, you don't want there to be water in that sample. So that's why we leave the sample to stand for 12 minutes after we've mixed up the sample. Most of the microbial contamination will remain mixed, but any contamination specifically associated with water will gravitate back to the bottom of the sample, so we can do a water phase test on that sample. And if we test the fuel sample, we know we're testing fuel sample only, not fuel with mixtures of water in it. So you get more consistent results by doing it that way. Another question, can you explain if the size of the colony spots after so many days has any influence on the number of microbes that were in the sample, or is it more of an indicator of how quickly those grow? By and large, fungi tend to produce larger colonies than bacteria. That's the main difference. If you're an experienced user of the test, you can actually tell the difference between fungi colonies and bacteria colonies. So it's not so much influenced by the number of samples. In fact, if you have a very heavy level of contamination, you'll tend to find the spots are smaller because they start to crowd each other out a little bit. That's why you get this speckled appearance in the test. But the test is designed so that, particularly with fuel samples, we have a countable number of colonies present, and the size should be ignored because it may be due to the different types of microbes present in the sample. Is the Micromonitor 2 test suitable for trend monitoring? Absolutely. I would say the majority of our test users use it for trend monitoring. The frequency of trend monitoring should be based on your particular operation and your perceived risk of microbial contamination. And I'd refer you to the IATA guidance and JIG guidance for more specific information on how often to do your Micromonitor 2 testing. But it's very flexible in that respect for doing trend monitoring. Okay, why is it important to test for spores rather than just testing for active growth? Well, the reason we believe that is the case is because if you can't get a sample which has free water or suspended water, spores may be the only indication that you have a microbial growth issue in the tank. Because spores are hydrophobic, that means they're repelled away from the water in the active growth. They are very readily dispersed in the fuel. So we believe it's important, particularly where you can't access the tank to get true low point samples. Ideally, of course, you would always test the true low point of the tank and you'd recover water. But in practice, this isn't always possible, both for aircraft and fuel storage tanks, and you can get isolated pockets of water in the tank which are very difficult for samples to take samples of. So that's why, if you can only recover a fuel phase sample, we think the ability to detect spores is an important indicator of contamination. What is the disposal procedure of the gel? I may have missed this. No, I didn't actually go on to it. Apologies. If the test is clear, then it can just be disposed of according to your local waste disposal regulations. If there is growth in the test, that growth is by microorganisms, and we recommend decontaminating the test first. Probably the easiest way to do this is just take the cap off and put it in a bucket of a household disinfectant or bleach solution, typically overnight. If you have an incinerator, it can also be sent for incineration. In a laboratory, if you do use the test in a laboratory, a lot of people don't, then you may have an autoclave, and you can, essentially a big pressure cooker, and you can decontaminate it that way. We also do some chlorine pills, which you can actually add to the gel and then shake it, and this will also is a good measure to take before disposing of the test. The test only detects alive microorganisms. Question. Mike, do you want to answer one so people don't get bored of my voice?
Absolutely. The test is designed to detect all aerobic bacteria, but it will also detect dormant spores, as Graham's outlined previously. So, we feel that's important because, as Graham's mentioned, sometimes spores can be the only indication that there's active microbial growth elsewhere in the tank. But yes, it will detect active bacteria.
And I guess the converse of that is, does it detect dead microorganisms? No, it doesn't, because the organisms have to be able to grow in order to be detected. Okay, I've got, hi Graham, as incubation time requires 4 days for colony to form, would you suggest the micromonitor to be used only during a long hanger check? Is there a way to expedite the incubation to 1 day? Of course, it's much more convenient in some areas if you can, in some cases, if you can test rapidly. As I mentioned, a heavy contamination is usually visible after 1 or 2 days. The way the Micromonitor 2 tests is, as I say, by a standard conventional microbiological method, and it does require the incubation period. And there are advantages and disadvantages in that. I don't particularly want to go into details, but I'm happy to take that offline if you want to discuss that. Hello, is the static dissipator additive limits would affect the test while performing the test? We tested against fuel with a wide range of additives, including SDA, plus 100, biocides, and they don't interfere with the ability of the test to detect contamination at typical use concentrations. Disposal, we've already had a question on that. If I leave the sample waiting to decanting, is it possible that the sample gets humidity by the air? In the time period allowed, I think that's very unlikely, not in a way that will critically affect the result. So we're only talking leaving it 12 minutes. It's just sufficient time for free water to settle, or most free water droplets to settle to the bottom of the sample. I've had a question on biocide, which I've already asked. So does biocides limit the test results? No. We have some validation reports on biocides. It's obviously critical if you do a biocide treatment of a fuel tank, you should always validate that treatment by taking fresh samples after treatment and confirming that you have actually killed microbes in the tank. Now, the issue there is, will the biocide interfere with the test result? And say you haven't actually had enough biocide to kill the microorganisms present, but because the biocide interferes with the test, it could cause a, if you like, false negative with the test result. So we've done a lot of validation work on that, and we're happy to share those technical reports. But the two common or two approved biocides for aviation fuel, I've got to be careful what I say here because there are certain changes in terms of what is actually approved as a biocide for aviation fuel. But two biocides widely approved for aviation fuels have both been evaluated, and they do not interfere with the test at typical use concentrations.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Graham and Mike, for the presentation and the information. That's the end of our time limit here, so we're going to go on to the next presentation. So next up, we've got Katja Skogman and Gabrielle von Flittner from ADN to present next.
Thank you, Amy. As mentioned, yes, I'm Katja Skogman, and with me today is Gabriella von Flittner. We are both from ADN, and I'm here to talk about EasyCook TTC and EasyCook M and management of microbial contaminations in the aviation industry with dip slides. Please note that ADN formerly was Orion Diagnostica, so some of you might know us by that name. Okay, first I will go through some general things about dip slides. Dip slides are culture tests, and the word dip slides comes from the functionality that you dip, you incubate, and you interpret the slide. You can detect microbial growth both from the fuel phase and the water phase, but more sensitively in the water phase, which is therefore always recommended. You can use the dip slides on site, so you can do the whole protocol from sampling to result on site, or you can sample and send a tube, for example, to your lab to be read. You could, of course, also send the fuel sample, but since you can do it already on site, that's much more efficient. Both sides are covered with growth media, which means that you automatically get parallel samples with the dip slides. The dip slides give you semi-quantitative results, and this is based on the sample volume that is absorbed by the growth media on the dip slide, by the use of a model chart for result reading, and the fact that microbes seldom grow evenly in a liquid. And then we also have the time between sampling and cultivation affecting the result. Our system is based on two dip slide tests, one for the bacterial growth and one for yeasts and molds. And lastly, I put up the reference to the scientific study done to show that all relevant microbes are found with our system. Then a short introduction to the two dip slides. The E=M and the E=TTC are used exactly the same way. The E=M contains a selective media for yeasts and molds, that is a malt agar-based growth media, and it has a shelf life of 6 months from manufacture. And the main significance of this test is that it measures the elevation of fungal density. And then the E=TTC is again a selective media for bacterial contamination, that is a TTC agar-based product. And here you have two options. You either have a tube with a shelf life of 6 months from manufacture or 9 months from manufacture, depending on the tube material. Here, different customers prefers different types of tubes. And the main significance here is that you get the total bacterial count of aerobic bacteria. And both kits contain 10 test tubes per kit. Okay, let's then look at handling and use of the slides. The slides are stored at the room temperature, protected from draught, temperature fluctuations, and light. And if you store the products in the kit box, then automatically you protect them from draught and light, but of course the temperature fluctuations is important as well. And as I mentioned, room temperature, this is defined as 18 to 25 degrees Celsius or 64 to 77 degrees Fahrenheit. The media, the growth media, so the product when open, the tube is opened, should not be touched, not to contaminate it. Very common for growth media products, or that is how it is. You shouldn't use the slide if it's discolored or dehydrated, or if the growth media is detached for some reason. If the product already looks contaminated, or if it's expired. Sometimes, for example, the transportation, if it's not transported in the correct way, the growth media could be detached from the slide. And very important, you don't have to be a microbiologist or expert to know how to use and to read the dip slides. It's very easy. Then we have reached the most important part of this presentation, where I will go through how to perform the test. And not to mix you up, please note that the dip slide in the picture, or the dip slides here in the following pictures, are general pictures, so not exactly the products that are used for this purpose. So as mentioned earlier, use the water phase. A thin layer of fuel doesn't disturb the test here, but we strongly recommend to always use the water phase because it's more sensitive. You mix the liquid sample, then you open the tube and you dip the slide in for 5 to 10 seconds in the liquid. And sometimes, in some situations, you might want to perform the inoculation in an optional way. It's also possible to spray the liquid directly onto the slide, and then you have to take care of that both sides are moistened thoroughly, or you could even wet the slide under a running stream. But in both these cases, you need to make sure that the dip slide is 5 to 10 seconds in contact with the liquid. And if you only have access to a sample from fuel phase, then you should shake it with an equal volume of water. You should separate the layers and then test the water layer. And always with liquid samples, it's important to blot off any excess liquid after sampling. This is not because it's disturbing the growth itself, but excess liquid might impair the interpretation, the reading, by making the slide really messy if all the liquid starts growing inside the tube. Then our dip slides are also suitable for surface samples. In this case, as we know, you can have contaminations or biofilms also on surfaces of tanks or tank walls or pipes. And in this case, you can do the sampling by swabbing, and then the sample is transferred directly onto the growth media with the swab. And here, instead of getting parallel samples, you can sample different positions on the different sides of the slide. And to describe the swabbing in a little bit greater detail, you should always use sterile swabs, and they should be moistened before use. We recommend using sterile water for moistening the swabs. And then you should rub the sample area with firm pressure, vertically, horizontally, and diagonally, very comprehensively, to get a good result. And usually you can use, for example, a template area, or a delimited area anyway, for example, 10 times 10 centimeters. And for hard to reach areas where you cannot use a specific area, you can, for example, roll the swab a certain number of rotations. And in both cases, it's important to repeat the test. When you repeat it from next time, you should do it the same way. You should use the same area. You should use the same number of rotations. Then you inoculate by gently rolling from left to right and bottom to top, as in the picture beside here. And remember not to touch the swab or the growth media. Then we have reached step 3, the incubation or cultivation or the growth step. Sometimes heavy growth can be seen already in one day, or if incubating at a higher temperature. But usually the incubation takes 2 to 4 days to give a result. And you can either incubate at room temperature, or you can use an incubator. And an incubator is a device used to grow culture samples at a specific preset temperature. You can see an example of an incubator in the picture beside the text. And the optimal temperature for growth is 20 to 35 degrees Celsius or 68 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit. We recommend that you use temperatures, if you use an incubator, of 27 to 30 degrees Celsius or 80 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit. And if no growth is detected within 2 days, then you just continue incubation. Some microbes grow really slowly, or of course, depending on the temperature, it can take a long time. If you prefer to do this at room temperature, of course, the room temperature is important. And so if it's really warm, you will get quicker results. Or if you incubate in a very cool temperature, you might want to continue even longer than 4 days to be sure to see the result. And then we have the interpretation step. To read the result, you remove the slide from the tube, and then you compare it to the model chart provided with the kit. And this is done totally by looking at the slide and looking at the model chart. We use CFU per milliliter here, and CFU means colony forming units. This was already mentioned earlier. And this means that it's based on that one microorganism is capable of forming one colony on the growth medium. And here, as already mentioned, the number of the colonies matter, not the size. In our instructions for use, we mention a detection limit of 10 to the power of 3 to 10 to the power of 7 CFU per milliliter. And this is because the test kit can be used for various different purposes. And but we know that microbes identified in fuel can be detected from the water phase at above 25 CFU per milliliter. And of course, you can detect microbes also above the 10 to the power of 7 concentration. But in this case, you will have so heavy growth that you cannot clearly identify which the magnitude is anymore. And if for some reason that would be interesting, you can dilute the sample, for example, in resistance situations, or if you want to identify a specific microbe. And this is a reliable and robust method, very established. Okay, then I took some pictures from our web pages as well. These are not included in the instructions for use, but these are better model charts than in the IFU itself. And this is just to give you an idea of what the different growth can look like. And please remember that very seldom in your samples you will have pure cultures. Here you see only pure culture results. So your growth might look very different depending on what it is and how much there is. So, but this gives you anyway an idea how it looks like. The drawn pictures in the IFU doesn't always resemble the growth you get. Okay, and then we have come to the disposal of the tests. The growth found in here is rarely pathogenic, but we always recommend that you treat it as it would be. And slides with growth, you should always dispose by burning, autoclaving, or immersing in a disinfectant for overnight. And as mentioned, the autoclaving is a heat treatment by pressurized steam at 121 degrees Celsius for 20 minutes. If you should choose to use disinfectant, you can, for example, pour the disinfectant directly into the tube and close it with a used slide in it and leave it for overnight, and then you can throw it away. But always remember to follow local laws and regulations. The insert is, of course, paper and the kit is cardboard, so they can be recycled as they are. Okay, thank you. Do we have any questions?
Yes. Hello, also on my behalf. So we have here a few questions. So the first one is that, is there any information on the typical amount of liquid sample that is absorbed or clings to the growth media during a deep slide test? Does it differ from fuel to water testing?
Okay, so as I mentioned, we always recommend to use the water phase to get the best possible result. The water phase will give a much more sensitive result. We have information on how much of the sample is absorbed. I cannot remember that by heart, but this volume is the basis for the model chart concentrations. So if this would be of big interest, just please contact me later.
Mm-hmm. If dip slide work by absorbing water into the agar surface, 0.2 milliliter, how much fuel is absorbed?
Okay, so this is pretty much like the previous question. We strongly recommend to use the water phase of the fuel. So
yeah.
I mean, if you have a thin layer of fuel, it doesn't disturb the test, but still, please do use the water phase.
Okay, and then the following. So when you have a fuel in which a film has already been formed, from where the sample is taken to place in the test?
Okay, if we can, I think this means that the biofilm is already visible, or some kind of growth is already visible, and then we of course know that we already have a very, very heavy contamination, usually, if it's not very unevenly distributed in there. So in that sense, in that situation, I'm not sure if the testing is relevant anymore. Then you need to go into actions anyway. But if you would be interested in getting some kind of sample, you would need to take into account that it shows one value, and it doesn't mean that it's even, because it's not evenly distributed in that sense. In this situation, it's never, but especially not in that situation.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned an extraction method by shaking water with fuel. Is that in line with how dip slides are advised to be used by IATA?
Okay. Yes. Yes. This is because we always recommend to use the water phase, and because we give the results in a semi-quantitative way. So even if this impacts the exact result, we don't actually calculate the results as exact results due to the model chart. So in this sense, it won't impact the final result, because we express the magnitude of the growth and not exact growth number of colonies.
And maybe to add to this, so it was in the last session I asked also that you should use clean water. You can use tap water, but then you need to know that it's clean.
Yeah, and this is very country specific. That, for example, in Finland, if you use the tap water, or if you would grow the tap water with our slides, you wouldn't even get any growth. But in many countries, the tap water is not clean enough. So then in those situations, I would use sterile water, or if you don't know the quality of your tap water.
Then the last question. So is it impossible for anaerobic bacteria to be in the fuel?
Well, no, but since the conditions in the conditions there are aerobic, so it will support growth of aerobic bacteria, not anaerobic. So even if there would from somewhere enter a non-aerobic bacterial contamination, it wouldn't grow in there.
Okay, so thank you. This was all the questions, and thank you to IATA also for arranging this seminar.
Yeah, thank you on my behalf as well.
Thank you, Katja and Gabriella. Very well presentation. And our next presenters, we have Ed English and Charlotte Lindhart from Fuel Quality Services and Merck. Ed?
Hello and good afternoon to everyone. I'd like to thank everyone for their patience in staying with us to the end of this webinar. My name is Edward English, and my colleague Charlotte Lindhart and I would like to welcome you to our discussion regarding Highlight Jet A1 Fuel Test, a rapid test for detection of microbiological contamination in fuel and fuel water mixtures. The Life Science Business Unit of Merck KGaA, located in Darmstadt, Germany, operates as Millipore Sigma in the US and Canada. On our agenda, we have a PowerPoint presentation followed by a short instructional video and then a question and answer session. This presentation and subsequent video are provided for informational and educational purposes only and do not constitute an endorsement by A4A or the Joint Inspection Group. So let's review the Highlight Jet A1 fuel test. The Highlight Jet A1 fuel test flow diagram shows a 6-step flow diagram that describes the basic overview of the Highlight Jet A1 fuel test for those webinar participants unfamiliar with the test protocol. We will collect a fuel sample and add a capture solution. We then shake the sample vigorously for 15 seconds and let the sample stand for 5 minutes. We then collect the blue phase or capture solution and sample it with the Highlight pen, reread it in the luminometer, and then take the appropriate action based on the test results. As previously discussed by Ms. Carrico of A4A, sample integrity is critical to ensure unbiased test results. To ensure sample integrity, use clean and uncontaminated sampling equipment. Properly prepare the sample site to eliminate potential for cross-contamination. Use proper sampling technique for aircraft wing, center tank, or other type of fuel storage tank. Use an HDPE or high-density polyethylene sample bottle or equivalent when performing the Highlight Jet A1 fuel test. The recommended sample volume is 1 liter. Sample appearance can be informative and deceiving. On the left is a jet fuel sample with free water and a biofilm with the fuel-water interface. Present in the biofilm is evidence of microbial activity that is currently ongoing or occurred sometime in the past. On the right is a jet fuel sample that is clear and bright without any free water or biofilm, indicating the absence of microbial activity. Or is that really the case? On this slide, the jet fuel sample has been superimposed onto the microbiological growth triangle. Please note the biofilm. This is an emulsion of fuel and water that allows the microbes in the water phase below to be in intimate contact with the fuel energy source above. In this slide, the clear and bright jet fuel sample has been superimposed onto a microbiological growth triangle again. Please note the suspended droplets of fuel and water in the bulk fuel sample. Please note the small bumps inside the red circle. These are microbes actively engaged in an intimate contact with the surface of a fuel droplet that is inside of a water droplet. Sample type is important, but not critical. The Highlight Jet A1 fuel test is compatible with all possible forms of aircraft or fuel tank sample, which includes a fuel and water sample mixture, a water sample only, or a fuel sample only. Sample volume is important, but not critical. Sample volume is typically 1 liter for the purposes of optimal sensitivity and detection. However, a sample volume can be 500 milliliters or less and still maintain adequate test sensitivity. Results interpretation. Test results are directly proportional to the level of microbial contamination in the sample. The higher the test result, the greater the contamination. If working to fix limits, results can be volume corrected. If no limits are given, limits can be developed based on experience and trend monitoring. In summary, sample integrity along with an effective testing protocol will result in consistent and reliable test results. Success with the Highlight Jet A1 fuel test is not dependent on any particular type of fuel sample. Highlight Jet A1 fuel testing must be carried out in a suitable non-glass container, preferably HDPE, or high-density polyethylene. A correct test result depends upon a correct testing procedure. Complete dispersion of the blue solution into the fuel during the mixing of the sample is crucial. After mixing, allow a minimum of 5 minutes settling time to ensure maximum recovery of the microorganisms in the sample. Highlight Jet A1 fuel test typical analysis time is less than 10 minutes. Use of the Highlight Jet A1 fuel test is simple, easy, and does not require any extensive training. After the test is completed, the used fuel test pen can be disposed as normal waste. There are no hazardous or microbiological waste disposal issues. For further information, please contact Fuel Quality Services at the numbers listed below or visit our website. Please launch the hands-on video.
The testing kit should include the following items. Fuel samples in
1,000 milliliter sample bottles,
as provided by maintenance. A fuel test kit that includes a small 3 milliliter pipette, a large 10 milliliter pipette, and Highlight fuel test pens with glue agent. Use the 3 milliliter pipette to extract the glue agent from the reservoir and transfer it into the jet fuel sample bottle. Afterward, put the lid on the fuel sample bottle and secure. Shake the fuel sample in a horizontal orientation for approximately 15 seconds to shear the blue agent to facilitate mixing with the fuel sample. Place the sample bottle on the counter and let stand for a minimum of 5 minutes. Afterward, remove the sample bottle cap to retrieve the blue agent from the bottom of the fuel sample bottle using the large 10 milliliter pipette. Open lid on the Highlight pen and place the blue agent from the large 10 milliliter pipette into the reservoir. If there is a layer of jet fuel on top of the blue agent, then carefully transfer only the blue agent into the reservoir. Carefully separate the lower and upper parts of the pen. Do not let the sample stick contact your skin during separation. Submerge the sample stick and 7 rings completely into the blue agent. Remove the sample stick to confirm all 7 rings are blue. Carefully press the tip of the sample stick perpendicular to a flat hard surface with sufficient force to cause the sample stick to retract into the clear cuvette. There will be a noticeable pop when the threads of the collar engage. Grasping the top of the pen with the thumb and forefinger, shake the pen back and forth along the longitudinal axis to mix the solution with the sample. Put the test pan into the Highlight 2 test chamber. Close the lid. The Highlight 2 will begin to measure the RLU value of the sample. This will take approximately 10 seconds. After the measuring is complete, the lid will open. The screen will present the test result in relative light units. Record the result as needed on the job card, logbook, or whatever control document you are using. Remove test pens and discard properly as non-hazardous.
Thank you for your attention, and let's move on to Q&A.
Yes, hello, and thank you for, as Ed said, for your attention. My name is Charlotte Lindhardt, and I shall try to answer your questions. So we can start with the first one that's come in can the highlight test be used to detect microbial growth in fuels other than Jet A1? Example, slop oils. Now, Ed, I don't know whether you have any comments on that. I mean, generally, it's for light to medium fuels. So all the aviation fuels, road diesel, medium level diesels. I think if we get into heavy oils, you simply will not get the separation of the capture solution. So there's a limit to how heavy you can go on the fuel side. Do you have anything to add to that, Ed?
Sure. Thank you, Charlotte. I recognize the name of the individual asking you the question, and I have their email address and their contact information. So I will answer their question offline. It's a good question, but I'd rather answer that offline so we can focus on the aviation component of this webinar.
Okay, I will continue to the next. Why must it be, or cannot a glass container be used? The reason for that is that glass is actually electrostatic, and if you have small water droplets, they will cling to the side of a glass bottle because the fuel is hydrophobic and the glass is effectively hydrostatic, so the water prefers to be on the sides of the glass. So when you put the capture solution, which is an aqueous compound, into the fuel and shake it to shear it, you will create an awful lot of tiny little water droplets, and they will prefer to stick to the walls of the bottle rather than to coalesce, as is what they're supposed to do. And therefore, glass is not suitable for performing the test. I would also, for that reason, advise against using glass for actually collecting the sample, because if you only have small volumes of water in the fuel sample that you get out of your tank, you may never be able to get those water droplets over and into the fuel because they're likely to stick to the walls of the glass sample. Next question, is the equipment suitable for field or off-site testing? Yes, it is battery operated, so you can easily use it in the field, and it runs on standard AA batteries, so there is no issues either with recharging as long as you have some spare batteries in your back pocket. If you get a result back in RLU, how does that relate to the CFUs? Now that is not something that I can say. The problem is that different bacterial and fungal cultures will have completely different amounts of ATP per cell or per colony forming unit. Basically, the ATP in an active cell is pretty much proportional to the size of the cell. So if you have a yeast cell that is typically 50 to 100 times bigger than a bacterial cell, so it will contain that much more ATP per cell, and on top of that, what we call colony forming units are not single cells. So some bacteria will lie only 1 or 2 bacteria together in a colony forming unit, and other will be 50 cells or more in a colony forming unit. So therefore, with a pure culture, I can easily give a correlation. With a mixed culture, I cannot. How long can samples sit before testing in a cool controlled environment and still have accurate results? As for all the other tests that have been mentioned today, I would suggest the shorter the better, and certainly no more than say 24 hours, but preferably, as everybody else I think has advocated, less than 24 hours, and ideally less than 4 hours. Right, is there a test limit to assess the level of microbial contamination? Well, that depends on what fuel and what conditions. So, I mean, there are some guidance limits in the IATA guidance material for wing tank samples, but other types of fuel, you may need completely different samples. So I would prefer not to answer that here. If you contact Ed English or myself, we can discuss it offline, so to say. What is the impact of temperature on the shelf life of the product? The product is supposed to be the expiry date that's labeled on the product, which is 12 months from manufacture, is based on storage at 2 to 8, so refrigerated storage. Now, the product can withstand higher temperatures, not preferably above 25 degrees C, but the shelf life will get shorter. So, sort of rule of thumb, at 20 degrees, 1 week is equivalent to 1 month at 5 degrees. Or 2 to 8, but if you go up to 25 degrees, then it's shorter, and at 25, the best guidelines I can give as an EC is that 1 week at 2 to 8 degrees is equivalent to 1 day at 25. So if you have a product and it has got 8 months shelf life left to the expiry date, then technically you can use that, but we do not recommend storage outside of refrigerated. But yes, it's stable enough that you can afford to take it out to go and do field testing, and you don't have to worry about refrigerating it. But as I said, not preferably above 25 degrees C. If you have fuel water samples, do you have to decant the water due to absorption of the blue aqueous solution? No, we recommend with highlight if you have a mixed sample, test the mixed sample, particularly because there is a certain probability that the highest concentration of microbes will be in the interface layer between the water bottom and the fuel. And if you separate the sample, then you are likely to exactly not test that particular part of neither the water nor the fuel. So both because it's easier, but also because you might get higher results out of it, we recommend testing the mixture of water and fuel. So next question, what is the minimum amount of sample that can be used? I mean, the problem, technically you can go down, if it's only water, you can work with as little as, say, 5 milliliter easily. If it's pure water, then we wouldn't normally do a volume correction. If you use fuel samples, we have tested as little as 50 milliliters. And yes, you can multiply your result up if you need to compare with a limit that's based on say, fuel RLU per liter. But of course, any uncertainty on the result and on the sampling, if you have to multiply your result by 20 to bring it from RLU per 50 milliliters up to RLU per liter, that uncertainty or error on your result will also be multiplied by 20. So we do recommend to use, depending on what detection limit you require, we do recommend to use, say, a minimum of 250, 500 milliliter. And for aircraft use, we recommend a liter.
Charlotte?
Yeah.
I would like to answer a question.
Okay.
Lowen had asked earlier, can the highlight be used with Jet A fuel? And the answer to that question is yes. In fact, the highlight Jet A1 fuel test system has been used in the aviation industry since early 2000s and has been in the IATA guidance manual since the 2nd edition. So it's been used for quite a long period of time, and that's one of the reasons that we were asked to participate in this webinar. Thank you, Charlotte.
Yeah, I have a question which has the equipment got data memory? Yes, it does. There is a software that you can use to set up sampling plans. There is also direct data storage, but you can also actually create sampling plans and load to the equipment, to the luminometer, and use to record your samples. And there is then a software you can use to analyze the results as well. But we did not feel that was relevant to go into in great detail. So please contact Ed or myself if you want more information about that. Is the analyzer equipment intrinsically safe? It is not safe for use in what is called explosive atmospheres. So you can use it in, I mean, it's used widely. We've done loads of tests in fuel farms and other places, but I would not use it in an area. It cannot be used in an area that is classed as risk of explosion. How well can highlight unit travel from site to site? How about shipping via FedEx from site to site? And how would I know if it needs calibration? You can easily ship it via FedEx or similar, the instrument. That's not a problem. Calibration, it doesn't actually necessarily require regular calibration. It is every time you switch it on, it has a built-in light source that checks that it sees the right amount of light, and if it doesn't, it will give an error message, and it will simply not let you proceed to take a sample or to measure a sample. So based on that, it doesn't require regular calibration because it does it automatically all the time. But obviously we can arrange it if you want to have it. It can be checked, but it requires then that it is sent to the manufacturing site, and really it is not required. And we do issue a letter that states that if that is required. Right. I think that is what we have of questions currently.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you, Ed. Wonderful presentation. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of the test kit presenters for their time and effort today. I would also like to provide you all with some contact information for the presenters. So you may want to take a screen capture of this slide. This is how you can reach out to each one of the test kit manufacturers if you have additional questions, or you have something specific, or if you have a question that they did not get to during their question and answer time. So I'll give you a minute to take a quick capture of all of that information. This will be provided after the fact as well, along with the video of the webinar. Last but certainly not least, I'd definitely like to thank Rami Ulloa from IATA for all her hard work to put together this webinar. I'd like to thank all of you for attending the webinar and for your patience. Again, our apologies for some of the audio problems that some of you may have experienced. On behalf of JIG, IATA, and A4A, thank you for your time today. Here's also some contact information for us if there's anything that you'd like to follow on with us. And I wish you all good health and be safe out there. Thank you.
Thank you.